Chapter 17, Part 2 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, The Rights of Children, Part 2. Section 5. Let those who have no faith in any instrumentalities for the rule of human beings, save the stern will and the strong hand, visit the Hanwell Asylum for the Insane. Let all self-styled practical men who, in the pride of their semi-savage theories, shower sarcasms upon the movements for peace, for the abolition of capital punishments and the like, go and witness to their confusion how 1,000 lunatics can be managed without the use of force. Let these sneerers at sentimentalisms reflect on the horrors of madhouses as they used to be, where was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, where chains clanked dismally, and where the silence of the night was rent by shrieks that made the belated passer-by hurry on shudderingly. Let them contrast with these horrors the calmness, the contentment, the tractability, the improved health of mind and body, and the not unfrequent recoveries that have followed the abandonment of the straitjacket regime, and then let them blush for their creed. And shall the poor maniac, with diseased feelings and a warped intellect, persecuted as he constantly is by the suggestions of a morbid imagination, shall a being with a mind so hopelessly chaotic that even the most earnest pleader for human rights would make his case an exception, shall he be amenable to a non-coercive treatment, and shall a child not be amenable to it? Will anyone maintain that madmen can be managed by suasion, but not children? That moral force methods are best for those deprived of reason, but physical force methods for those possessing it? Hardly. The boldest defender of domestic despotism will not assert so much. If by judicious conduct the confidence even of the insane may be obtained, if even to the beclouded intelligence of a lunatic, kind attentions and a sympathetic manner will carry the conviction that he is surrounded by friends and not by demons, and if, under that conviction, even he, though a slave to every disordered impulse, becomes comparatively docile, how much more under the same influence will a child become so? Do but gain a boy's trust. Convince him by your behavior that you have his happiness at heart. Let him discover that you are the wiser of the two. Let him experience the benefits of following your advice, and the evils that arise from disregarding it. And fear not, you will readily enough guide him. Not by authority is your sway to be obtained, neither by reasoning, but by inducement. Show in all your conduct that you are thoroughly your child's friend, and there is nothing that you may not lead him to. The faintest sign of your approval or dissent will be his law. You have won from him the key of all his feelings, and instead of the vindictive passions that severe treatment would have aroused, you may by a word call forth tears or blushes or the thrill of sympathy, may excite any emotion you please, may, in short, effect something worth calling education. Section 6. If we wish a boy to become a good mechanic, we ensure his expertness by an early apprenticeship. The young musician that is to be passes several hours a day at his instrument. Initiatory courses of outline drawing and shading are gone through by the intended artist. For the future accountant, a thorough drilling in arithmetic is prescribed. The reflective powers are sought to be developed by the study of mathematics. Thus, all training is founded on the principle that culture must precede proficiency. In such proverbs as "habit is second nature" and "practice makes perfect," men have expressed those net products of universal observation on which every educational system is ostensibly based. The maxims of a village schoolmistress and the speculations of a Pestalozzi are alike pervaded by the theory that the child should be accustomed to those exertions of body and mind which will in future life be required of it. Education means this or nothing. What now is the most important attribute of man as a moral being? What faculty above all others should we be solicitous to cultivate? May we not answer, the faculty of self-control? This it is which forms a chief distinction between the human being and the brute. It is in virtue of this that man is defined as a creature, looking before and after. It is in their larger endowment of this that the civilized races are superior to the savage. In supremacy of this consists one of the perfections of the ideal man. Not to be impulsive, not to be spurred hither and thither by each desire that in turn comes uppermost, but to be self-restrained, self-balanced, governed by the joint decision of the feelings in council assembled, before whom every action shall have been fully debated and calmly determined. This it is which education, moral education at least, strives to produce. But the power of self-government, like all other powers, can be developed only by exercise. Whoso is to rule over his passions in maturity must be practiced in ruling over his passions during youth. Observe, then, the absurdity of the coercive system. Instead of habituating a boy to be a law to himself as he is required in after life to be, it administers the law for him. Instead of preparing him against the day when he shall leave the paternal roof by inducing him to fix the boundaries of his actions, and voluntarily confine himself within them, it marks out these boundaries for him, and says, "Cross them at your peril." Here we have a being who, in a few years, is to become his own master, and by way of fitting him for such a condition, he is allowed to be his own master as little as possible, whilst in every other particular it is thought desirable that what the man will have to do, the child should be well drilled in doing. In this most important of all particulars, the controlling of himself, it is thought that the less practice he has, the better. No wonder that those who have been brought up under the severest discipline should so frequently turn out the wildest of the wild. Such a result is just what might have been looked for. Indeed, not only does the physical force system fail to fit the youth for his future position, it absolutely tends to unfit him. Were slavery to be his lot, if his afterlife had to be passed under the rule of a Russian autocrat, or of an American cotton planter, No better method of training could be devised than one which accustomed him to that attitude of complete subordination he would subsequently have to assume. But just to the degree in which such treatment would fit him for servitude, must it unfit him for being a free man amongst free men. Section 7. But why is education needed at all? Why does not the child grow spontaneously into a normal human being? Why should it be requisite to curb this propensity, to stimulate the other sentiment, and thus, by artificial aids, to mold the mind into something different from what it would of itself become? Is not there here an anomaly in nature? Throughout the rest of creation we find the seed and the embryo attaining to perfect maturity without external aid. Drop an acorn into the ground, and it will in due time become a healthy oak without either pruning or training. The insect passes through its several transformations unhelped, and arrives at its final form possessed of every needful capacity and instinct. No coercion is needed to make the young bird or quadruped adopt the habits proper to its future life. Its character, like its body, spontaneously assumes complete fitness for the part it has to play in the world. How happens it, then, that the human mind alone tends to develop itself wrongly? Must there not be some exceptional cause for this? Manifestly. And if so, a true theory of education must recognize this cause. It is an indisputable fact that the moral constitution which fitted man for his original predatory state differs from the one needed to fit him for this social state to which multiplication of the race has led. In a foregoing part of our inquiry, Chapter 2, it was shown that the law of adaptation is effecting a transition from the one constitution to the other. Living then, as we do, in the midst of this transition, we must expect to find sundry phenomena which are explicable only upon the hypothesis that humanity is at present partially adapted to both these states, and not completely to either, has only in a degree lost the dispositions needed for savage life, and has but imperfectly acquired those needed for social life. The anomaly just specified is one of these. The tendency of each new generation to develop itself wrongly indicates the degree of modification that has yet to take place. Those respects in which a child requires restraint are just the respects in which he is taking after the aboriginal man. The selfish squabbles of the nursery, the persecution of the playground, the lyings and petty thefts, the rough treatment of inferior creatures, the propensity to destroy, all these imply that tendency to pursue gratification at the expense of other beings, which qualified man for the wilderness, and which disqualifies him for civilized life. We have seen, however, that this incongruity between man's attributes and his conditions is in course of being remedied. We have seen that the instincts of the savage must die of inanition, that the sentiments called forth by the social state must grow by exercise, and that if the laws of life remain constant, this modification will continue until our desires are brought into perfect conformity with our circumstances. When now that ultimate state in which morality shall have become organic is arrived at, this anomaly in the development of the child's character will have disappeared. The young human being will no longer be an exception in nature, will not, as now, tend to grow into unfitness for the requirements of afterlife, but will spontaneously unfold itself into that ideal manhood whose every impulse coincides with the dictates of the moral law. Education, therefore, in so far as it seeks to form character, serves only a temporary purpose, and, like other institutions resulting from the non-adaptation of man to the social state, must in the end die out. Hence we see how doubly incongruous with the moral law is the system of training by coercion. Not only does it necessitate direct violations of that law, but the very work which it so futilely attempts to perform will not need performing when that law has attained to its final supremacy. Force in the domestic circle, like magisterial force, is merely the complement of immorality. Immorality we have found to be resolvable into non-adaptation. Non-adaptation must in time cease, and thus the postulate with which this old theory of education starts will eventually become false. Rods and ferules, equally with the staffs and handcuffs of the constable, the jailer's keys, the swords, bayonets, and cannon with which nations restrain each other, are the offspring of iniquity, can exist only whilst supported by it, and necessarily share in the badness of their parentage. Born therefore as it is of man's imperfections, governing as it does by means of those imperfections, and abdicating as it must when equity begins to reign, coercion in all its forms, educational or other, is essentially vicious. Section 8. And here we are naturally led to remark once more the necessary incongruity between the perfect law and the imperfect man. Whatsoever of utopianism there may seem to be in the foregoing doctrines is due not to any error in them, but to faults in ourselves. A partial impracticability must not perplex us, must, on the contrary, be expected. Just in proportion to our distance below the purely moral state, must be our difficulty in acting up to the moral law, either in the treatment of children or in anything else. It is not for us, however, to magnify and ponder over this difficulty. Our course is simple. We have just to fulfill the law as far as in us lies, resting satisfied that the limitations necessitated by our present condition will quite soon enough assert themselves. Meanwhile, let it be remarked that the main obstacle to the right conduct of education lies rather in the parent than in the child. It is not that the child is insensible to influences higher than that of force, but that the parent is not virtuous enough to use them. Fathers and mothers who enlarge upon the trouble which filial misbehavior entails upon them, strangely assume that all the blame is due to the evil propensities of their offspring, and none to their own. Though on their knees they confess to being miserable sinners, Yet to hear their complaints of undutiful sons and daughters, you might suppose that they were themselves immaculate. They forget that the depravity of their children is a reproduction of their own depravity. They do not recognize in these much scolded, often beaten little ones so many looking glasses wherein they may see reflected their own selfishness. It would astonish them to assert that they behave as improperly to their children as their children do to them. Yet a little candid self-analysis would show them that half their commands are issued more for their own convenience or gratification than for corrective purposes. "I won't have that noise," exclaims a disturbed father to some group of vociferous juveniles, and the noise ceasing, he claims to have done something towards making his family orderly. Perhaps he has, but how? By exhibiting that same evil disposition which he seeks to check in his children, a determination to sacrifice to his own happiness the happiness of others. Observe, too, the impulse under which a refractory child is punished. Instead of anxiety for the delinquent's welfare, that severe eye and compressed lip denote rather the ire of an offended ruler. Express some such inward thought as, "You little wretch, we'll soon see who is to be master." Uncover its roots, and the theory of parental authority will be found to grow not out of man's love for his offspring, but out of his love of dominion. Let any one who doubts this listen to that common reprimand, "How dare you disobey me?" And then consider what the emphasis means. No moral force education is widely practicable even now, if parents were civilized enough to use it. But of course the obstacle is in a measure reciprocal. Even the best samples of childhood as we now know it will be occasionally unmanageable by suasion. And when inferior natures have to be dealt with, the difficulty of doing without coercion must be proportionably great. Nevertheless, patience, self-denial, a sufficient insight into youthful emotions, and a due sympathy with them, added to a little ingenuity in the choice of means, will usually accomplish all that can be wished. Only let a parent's actions and words and manner show that his own feeling is a thoroughly right one, and he will rarely fail to awaken a responsive feeling in the breast of his child. Section 9. One further objection remains to be noticed. It will probably be said that if the rights of children are coextensive with those of adults, it must follow that children are equally entitled with adults to citizenship, and ought to be similarly endowed with political power. This inference looks somewhat alarming, and it is easy to imagine the triumphant air of those who draw it, and the smiles with which they meditate upon the absurdities it suggests. Nevertheless, the answer is simple and decisive. There must go two things to originate an incongruity, and before passing censure, it is needful to say which of the two incongruous things is in fault. In the present case, the incongruity is between the institution of government on the one side, and a certain consequence of the law of equal freedom on the other. Which of the two is to be condemned for this? In the above objection, it is tacitly assumed that the blame lies with this consequence of the law of equal freedom, whereas the fact is just the other way. It is with the institution of government that the blame lies. Were the institution of government an essentially right one, there would be reason to suppose that our conclusion was fallacious. But being as it is the offspring of immorality, it must be condemned for conflicting with the moral law, and not the moral law for conflicting with it. Were the moral law universally obeyed, government would not exist. And did government not exist, the moral law could not dictate the political enfranchisement of children. Hence, the alleged absurdity is traceable to the present evil constitution of society, and not to some defect in our conclusion. Section 10. Concerning the extension of the law of equal freedom to children, we must therefore say that equity commands it, and that expediency recommends it. We find the rights of children to be deducible from the same axiom, and by the same argument as the rights of adults, whilst denial of them involves us in perplexities out of which there seems to be no escape. The association between filial subservience and barbarism, the evident kinship of filial subservience to social and marital slavery, and the fact that filial subservience declines with the advance of civilization, suggest that such subservience is bad. The viciousness of a coercive treatment of children is further proved by its utter failure to accomplish the chief end of moral education, the culture of the sympathies, by its tendency to excite feelings of antagonism and hate, and by the check which it necessarily puts upon the development of the all-important faculty of self-control. Whilst, on the other hand, a non-coercive treatment being favorable to, and almost necessitating, constant appeals to the higher feelings, must, by exercising those feelings, improve the character, and must, at the same time, accustom the child to that condition of freedom in which its afterlife is to be passed. It turns out, too, that the very need for a moral training of children is but temporary, and that consequently a true theory of the filial relationship must not presuppose, like the command and obedience theory, that such a need is permanent. Lastly, we find reason to attribute whatever of incompatibility there may be between these conclusions and our daily experience, not to any error in them, but to the necessary incongruity between the perfect law and an imperfect humanity. End of chapter 17, part 2.